You should rest and stop disturbing us with all that machine racket." I heard that for the first time on the day I was discharged from the hospital, in the small kitchen of the 14th floor apartment in a building on the Upper East Side. The apartment I had bought at age 29 with 10 years of savings from sewing dresses for Manhattan's wealthy. The apartment I had transferred to my daughter last year because someone told me it was smart tax planning. Machine racket. Kevin Reeves, my son-in-law, reduced 40 years of my skill to those two words. Machine racket. But before I tell you that, I need to tell you what happened before it. Because that phrase wasn't the first blow. It was only the final slap in a sequence I hadn't seen forming. My name is Martha Jean Kowalski. I am 68 years old. No, I have been sewing since I was 14, trained under Mrs. Maria Szczepanska, the finest Polish seamstress in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, a woman whose hands never trembled with the scissors even at 75. I have made garments for hundreds of New York women over 40 years, from brides in Queens who needed a wedding dress within a budget to the Park Avenue set who required evening gowns they couldn't find in any boutique on Fifth Avenue. I taught my daughter, Rebecca, to hold a needle from the time she was 7, though she didn't follow the trade, and I have nothing to complain about in that. On February 3rd, I was admitted to Lenox Hill Hospital with pneumonia that the doctor said had been developing for 2 weeks while I wasn't paying attention. The kind of inattention that belongs to someone who is always working. The kind who says, "I'll rest after I finish this order." I was in the hospital for 8 days. And during those 8 days, Kevin Reeves, my son-in-law, the man my daughter had married 3 years earlier, in a small ceremony that Kevin had choreographed down to the last detail in a way I called careful at the time, and now call controlling, entered the apartment and sold every piece of my work equipment. 2 Bernina sewing machines, $7,000 each. The first one I bought at 21, the second in 2015. The large custom oak cutting table that Jimmy at the woodworking shop on Atlantic Avenue had built specially for me when I was 25. The fabric cabinet, 32 varieties, including 20 meters of Italian silk I had ordered specifically for an April commission, and 7 meters of black velvet I had tracked down at a Soho supplier after 3 months of searching. The notions box, the collection of zippers, buttons, lace, and beaded trim I had accumulated over 20 years, each piece sourced from a different place, many of them no longer findable anywhere. All of it gone, without asking me, without telling me. While I lay in a hospital bed with an IV line and a pulse oximeter, Kevin Reeves had hired people to empty my workroom. I learned this on the afternoon of Tuesday, February 11th, when I came home. Not because Rebecca told me. My daughter said nothing, only stood in the kitchen doorway with a cup of coffee in her hand and her eyes aimed at anything but my face. I knew because I walked into the room that had carried the smell of fabric and thread and sewing machine oil for 40 years. And that room was silent and empty and smelled of fresh paint. The kind of tasteful, soft gray people use when they want to transform a space into something else. They were painting over my workroom to turn it into Rebecca's yoga studio. I didn't speak right away. I stood in the doorway and looked at the empty space. At the place where the 2 Berninas had stood. At the floor, impressions the oak table had left in the old wood. At the window that looked towards Central Park that I had sat beside for thousands of mornings, cutting fabric in daylight because daylight is the most honest light when you're working with color. Then I walked into the living room, and I saw the sofa, a cognac leather sofa, top grain Italian leather, walnut frame, heavy decorative stitching in the Chesterfield style, sat in the corner where my old moss green armchair had lived. I had bought that armchair in 1998 at a second-hand shop on West 72nd Street, sat down in it, and knew immediately it was mine. Firm enough in the back to keep a proper posture while working, soft enough in the cushion to sit in all day without wearing out. That chair was gone with everything else. "Isn't it beautiful, Mom?" Rebecca asked from behind me. Something was in her voice. Not genuine enthusiasm, but the thing people use when they're trying to convince themselves that what just happened is normal. Kevin stepped out of the hallway, white button-down shirt pressed and tucked, hair combed. He looked at me in the way of a man who sees no reason to apologize. "We used the money from selling those things to buy this," he said. "The living room needed updating for a long time, and the other room will be Rebecca's exercise space. The doctor said she needs yoga daily for her back." I looked at the leather sofa, looked at Kevin. "You sold my sewing machines without asking me," I said. "Not a question." Well, just the truth spoken plainly. "You were sick," Kevin said, his voice as level as someone explaining arithmetic. "We had to make decisions. And honestly, Mom, you're 68 years old. Sitting at a machine like that isn't good for your back or your eyes. This is a good opportunity for you to rest." "My orders," I started. "Cancel them," Kevin said. "Those don't matter." He gestured toward the sofa. "Go ahead and sit down, Mom. Italian leather." And that was when Rebecca, my daughter, the person I had worked double shifts for 12 years to put through college and graduate school, walked in and said, in the gentle and careful voice of someone trying not to make an atmosphere, "Mom, don't sit on that right now, okay? You just got back from the hospital. Hospital clothes might mark the leather. Don't sit on the leather sofa that was bought with the money from selling my sewing machines in the apartment I had paid for at 29, because the clothes I wore home from the hospital might mark it." I stood in the living room of my own apartment, not mine anymore, the apartment I had signed over, and for the first time in 68 years, I felt like I didn't belong here. And in that moment, Kevin Reeves said the line I will never forget. "You should rest and stop disturbing us with all that machine racket." I looked at my daughter. Rebecca didn't look back at me. I went to the bedroom. Not to cry. I didn't cry. Not yet. I went to think. In the bedroom, on the top right shelf of the old wardrobe, was a green tin box. The kind of British biscuit tin people repurpose for odds and ends once the cookies are gone. I had owned it since I was 35, given to me by a client, alongside a box of Fortnum and Mason shortbread one Christmas. And I had kept the tin because its lid sealed tightly, and I used it for things I didn't want dust getting into. Important things in the emotional sense, not documents or money, but small pieces of paper, old photographs, things people keep not for their value, but for the memories attached to them. I took the tin down and opened it. The familiar things were inside. A black and white photo of Mrs. Szczepanska at 70, still holding her scissors, looking straight into the lens without smiling. A small piece of deep red velvet, the first piece I ever cut alone without her standing beside me. Business cards from particular clients I had kept through the decades. And at the very bottom, beneath the cards, was a paper folded into quarters. An address and phone number written in my own hand in 2018. Blue ink on hotel notepad paper. Vivian Ashford, 580 Park Avenue, 16th floor. 212555047. And Eleanor, her daughter, 91755509293. Vivian Ashford. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at that paper. Through the bedroom door, I could hear Kevin on the phone in the living room, the cheerful, confident voice of a man telling someone that a story has been wrapped up. I could hear Rebecca in the kitchen, the sound of ceramic cups, the coffee machine. Yes, and I thought, Vivian Ashford. The 73-year-old woman, fashion industry titan, who 15 years ago had knocked on the door of my workroom and said she had heard from 3 friends that I was the only person in New York who could properly cut the skirt fall on a middle-aged woman's dress without making her look heavier. the woman who over the following 7 years had become my most consistent client, who ended every fitting with at least an hour's conversation about fabric, craft, and the New York of the 1970s and 80s when she was still building her fashion empire from nothing in a Tribeca studio apartment. The woman I had last seen in 2020 when the pandemic began and she had said at my workroom door, "Martha, this war will end. When you need me, call." And I had put the paper in the green tin box and had not called, because I was not someone accustomed to asking favors. Now I needed to call, to understand why losing 2 Bernina machines was not just losing 2 machines. You need to know how I learned this skill and what it means to me. I was born in 1956 in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, in a neighborhood where Polish and Italian and Puerto Rican families lived side by side in red brick tenements, shared laundry machines in the basement, and knew the names of each other's children. My father was a house painter. My mother was a cashier at the Polish grocery on Manhattan Avenue. We weren't poor in the sense of going hungry, but we counted every dollar the way families who aren't poor in Greenpoint in the 1960s tended to do. Mrs. Maria Szczepanska lived on the 2nd floor of our building. She had been widowed early. Mr. Szczepansky died in a construction accident in 1958 when she was 32 with 2 small children. Mrs. Szczepanska supported those 2 children through sewing, not ordinary sewing, but high-end work for the wealthy women of Manhattan who came to Greenpoint because they had heard of her. She had no formal credentials. She had only her hands, her sharp eye, and 40 years of knowledge learned from her mother and grandmother in Krakow before she emigrated. I began sitting at her feet, learning to sew at 14. Initially, only because Mrs. Szczepanska had asked my mother to send me down in the afternoons when she was overwhelmed with orders. I was paid $2 a day to fold fabric, clip threads, and deliver finished garments to clients. But in those afternoons, I sat beside her and watched her work. Watched in the way that some people watch and learn, and some people watch and see nothing. Mrs. Szczepanska noticed. One afternoon in March 1970, she placed a piece of fabric in front of me and told me to cut along the chalk line she had drawn. I picked up the scissors and cut. She said nothing while I cut, only watched. When I finished, she picked up the piece, examined the cut, and said, "Good. Your hands know fabric." Hands that know fabric. That was Mrs. Szczepanska's way of saying someone had an aptitude for the trade. Not a social compliment, but a technical assessment. This person's hands and the fabric find each other the right way, not too tight and not too loose. The instinct for cutting force and fiber tension is innate. From that day, she taught me in earnest. Not by the hour and not from a syllabus. She taught the way a craftsperson teaches, by letting me watch and try and fail and try again, by pointing out errors, not in words, but by placing her hand over mine and adjusting. I trained with Mrs. Szczepanska for 4 years, alongside high school, until I was 18, and she said she had taught me everything she knew. What remains, you'll have to teach yourself, she said. Fabric is the best teacher if you're willing to listen. At 18, I had no money for design school, no connections in the New York fashion world. But I had hands that knew fabric, and 4 years with Mrs. Szczepanska, and the kind of determination that belongs to Greenpoint. The determination of someone who has nothing to lose but labor and time. I started by taking in alterations for neighbors in the neighborhood, then opened a small repair service in a corner of Aunt Irina's laundromat on Manhattan Avenue, then gradually built a clientele through word of mouth. Everyone agreed that Martha Kowalski did clean work, kept her word on deadlines, and charged less than the shops in Manhattan. At 23, I rented a small studio in the Lower East Side. Not a fancy shop, a room in an old building on Ludlow Street, creaking wood floors, a window looking out at a brick wall, sunlight only in the mornings. But it was mine in the sense that I paid for it with money I had earned. and I put the second-hand Pfaff sewing machine I had bought from a shop on Canal Street on the work table, and I began. The early years weren't easy. New York in the late 70s was a city struggling. The municipal finances were close to bankruptcy. The Lower East Side was unstable, and the people with money to spend on custom garments were few. I did everything that paid: alterations, drapery, parade uniforms for local clubs, Halloween costumes. I turned nothing down. And through each type of work, I learned something more about fabric and stitching and the way people inhabit their clothes. The turning point came at 27, when Gloria Martinez, a Puerto Rican woman who lived in my Lower East Side building and did hair for clients from the Upper East Side, mentioned to one of her clients that there was a Polish girl on Ludlow Street who sewed very well and charged very reasonably. That client was an assistant to a French fashion editor living in New York, who needed a cocktail dress made urgently for a weekend event and couldn't find a shop willing to take the job in 3 days. I accepted that order. I worked 36 hours without sleep. I delivered on time, and the French editor called me directly and said in her accented English, "You sew better than my dressmaker in Paris." That was not entirely true. Her Paris dressmaker was certainly more skilled than I was in many respects. But it was the right word from the right person at the right moment. And from then on, Manhattan clients began making their way to the Lower East Side to find me. At 29, I had enough to buy the Upper East Side apartment. Not a large one. 14th floor, 2 bedrooms, 1 workroom big enough for a cutting table, and 2 machines. But it was mine. My name on the deed. And the workroom window faced east just enough to catch a sliver of Central Park if you craned your neck at the right angle. At 32, I met David Hoffman at a client's party. He was a music teacher, calm and thoughtful and indifferent to fashion in a way that put me at ease, because I didn't want the person sharing my life to be someone who judged me by what I wore. We married at 34. Rebecca was born at 35, while I was waiting to deliver an urgent bridal order, and David was teaching piano to an 8-year-old in the Bronx. David died when Rebecca was 17. Pancreatic cancer, 6 months from diagnosis to death. Nothing about those 6 months was either fast enough or slow enough. I had worked and cared for him and driven Rebecca to school and cooked dinner and done the laundry, and every night sat in the workroom after Rebecca and David had gone to sleep, needle in hand, cutting fabric, not because I had an urgent order, but because work was the only thing that allowed me to keep going. After David died, I worked more. Not because I needed the money. We weren't rich, but we weren't short. But because working was how I got through that period. I took on more orders, learned new techniques, bought the first Bernina the year Rebecca started college at NYU. NYU tuition was not inexpensive. I worked double shifts during the years Rebecca completed her undergraduate and graduate degrees. Not because anyone forced me to, but because my daughter needed to graduate and I had a skill that could earn her tuition. That was the simplest thing in the world. I had something. My daughter needed something, and I used what I had to give her what she needed. 15 years later, Rebecca Hoffman became Rebecca Reeves. She married Kevin Reeves, a fund manager, and I stood in the church in a cocktail dress I had made for myself and tried to find in Kevin's face something I could believe in. I didn't find it, but Rebecca was happy. And it is not my place to judge my daughter's happiness. Vivian Ashford first sought me out in 2009 after a brief call that her assistant made asking whether I could take a new client the following Friday. "She'd like to place an order," the assistant said. "She's heard about your work from 3 friends?" I took the appointment without knowing who the client was. Vivian Ashford arrived exactly on time. She never arrived late in the 8 years I worked with her. Wearing a gray cashmere coat and a Patek Philippe on her left wrist that I recognized immediately because I had made a dress the year before for the wife of a Swiss watchmaking company chairman. Silver hair, short and neat. the style of a woman who doesn't want to spend time on her hair. Real New York in her voice. Not the voice of someone who learned to speak from books, but the voice of someone who grew up here and carries the whole city in it. "I'm Vivian Ashford," she said, and shook my hand. A firm handshake, the kind belonging to a person who doesn't need to prove anything further. "I need a formal gown for a conference in October, and a coat for a London trip in November, and perhaps a few other things if we work well together." I had known the name Vivian Ashford since the 1980s. Anyone working in New York fashion knew that name. She was a co-founder of Ashford Collection, the women's fashion house that the magazines tended to describe as high fashion for women who don't need to announce that they're wearing high fashion. The kind of description only someone who truly understands fashion can write. She had sold the majority of her stake to a French conglomerate in 2015, but remained honorary chairman and was still one of the most respected voices in New York fashion. "I'll try," I said, not false modesty but sincerity. "Can I see your current wardrobe first?" Vivian Ashford looked at me for a second and then smiled. Brief, not wide, but real. "That's the right question," she said. For the 7 years that followed, Vivian Ashford came to my workroom every Friday at 3 in the afternoon for about an hour. Not always for fittings, sometimes only to see what I was working on, to talk about fabric, about design, about how fashion was and wasn't changing. She brought knowledge of the fashion industry's production and distribution side that I lacked. I brought knowledge of construction technique and an understanding of how a woman's body moves inside clothing, something she said she had always been missing in her collaborators. Those were the best 8 years of my 40-year career. Not because Vivian Ashford mattered more than my other clients, but because during those years I was working alongside someone who understood that what I did was a craft, not a service. That distinction matters more than I can fully explain. The pandemic came and the Friday afternoon stopped. The last time I saw Vivian Ashford was March 2020, before the lockdowns began. She stood in my workroom doorway in her gray coat and said, "Martha, this war will end. When you need me, call." I didn't call for 4 years after that, because I found enough work through old channels and because I was not accustomed to asking for things. But now, sitting in the bedroom of an apartment that was no longer mine, holding the paper with the address and phone number, I understood that "when you need me" was not a social nicety. Vivian Ashford did not say things without meaning them. I put the paper down and looked at the ceiling. The room smelled of fresh paint from the room next door, the room being painted gray for the yoga studio. Outside the window, New York was going dark, street lights coming on in the February cold. I didn't cry. There was no time to cry. I picked up the phone and called Eleanor Ashford, Vivian's daughter, the number 91755502993. I had kept in the green tin box since 2018. Over 40 years in the trade, I sewed for many different kinds of people. Enough to say without exaggeration that I have seen a great many New York lives through the fittings in my workroom. People tend to think that when someone stands on the fitting platform and the seamstress sits low on a chair with pins to adjust the seams, the person standing is the more important one. In fact, it is not so. When you are standing still and someone is working around you in focused silence, you tend to say things you don't say elsewhere. Not because you trust the seamstress more than others, but because that moment has the quality of privacy that people rarely find in city life. The first client I never forgot was Angela Ferrara in 1984. She came through a referral, needing a wedding dress in 3 weeks because her original dressmaker had withdrawn from the job. Angela Ferrara was 32 at the time, marrying her second husband, and during the second fitting, she stood on the platform and said, "Miss Martha, I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, but I like the way you look at me. better than the way people usually look at me. I didn't ask what she meant by that. I only continued adjusting the skirt hem and said, "Stand as comfortably as you can." That was the principle I kept for 40 years. The person wearing a garment should be most at ease inside it, not the garment making the wearer look the way the designer intended. The second client I never forgot was Mrs. Dorothy Chen in 1996, a woman of 80, originally from Shanghai, who had lived in New York for 50 years and still commissioned clothes in a style combining classical Chinese aesthetics with American urban sensibility. Mrs. Chen taught me a great deal about how Shanghai silk differs from Western silk in the way it catches light, and about how people in different cultures think of clothing not only as utility or adornment, but as social language. "You know," she would say in her Shanghai accented English, "where I grew up, people read each other's histories through their clothes before they ever asked a name." I thought about that sentence for years afterward, when I was sewing for Vivian Ashford, and understanding that I was creating something that would speak to an audience before she opened her mouth. Eleanor Ashford, 45 years old, executive director of the Ashford Foundation, polished and practical in the way of someone raised by Vivian Ashford, took my call on Thursday evening, February 13th, and asked very little. "My mother has asked after you many times over the past 4 years," Eleanor said. "I'll tell her you called. Would next Monday at 11 work?" "Yes," I said. "One thing," Eleanor said before hanging up. "Do you need any help with transportation? I can send a car." "That won't be necessary," I said. "I can still take the subway." "I know," Eleanor said, and in her voice I heard something I only identified later: relief. Monday morning, February 17th. I wore the long black coat I had made for myself in 2017. Italian wool, lined inside with brocade salvaged from an old ball gown a client had never collected. Is the neckline and cuffs detailed with hand-stitched lace. Not to make an impression, but because that coat was the finest thing I had left after Kevin sold off my equipment, and when you go to see someone important, you wear the best thing you have, not to prove anything, but to show respect to both sides of the encounter. The building at 580 Park Avenue was the kind of building people don't immediately recognize as a place where very wealthy people live. No prominent name or decorative signage, only polished bronze doors and a doorman in a suit standing in a lobby kept warm enough. The doorman checked my name, called upstairs, then showed me to the elevator. Vivian Ashford opened the door herself. Not an assistant, not a housekeeper. She herself, 73 years old, platinum hair still short and neat as I remembered, wearing straight black trousers and a cream cashmere pullover. She looked me over from head to toe. Not the look of appraisal, but the look of someone checking whether a long-absent friend is all right. "Martha," she said. "Vivian," I said. She stepped aside to let me in. "Are you all right?" she asked as she closed the door. "No," I said, "but I'm managing." She looked at me for a second. "Good. Sit down and tell me." Vivian Ashford's apartment was not what comes to mind when people say billionaire's apartment. No gold or marble or the kind of ostentatious display that newspaper profiles tend to describe. It was large and bright and filled with books and real art. Not art purchased as investment, but art chosen by someone who lives with it every day and knows why she chose each piece. The living room looked out over Central Park from the 16th floor, and Vivian made tea in the kitchen while I sat in the armchair by the window and looked out at the park. I told her everything, all of it, not in the manner of complaint, but in the manner of a narrator. February 3rd. I went into the hospital, February 7th. Kevin sold the equipment, February 11th. I came home to an empty workroom, what Kevin said about the machine racket, the leather sofa, Rebecca, and the comment about not sitting on it. And finally, the thing I had to say even though I didn't want to. I had signed the apartment over to Rebecca the previous year. Vivian listened without interrupting. When I finished, she refilled the tea and looked out the window for a moment. "Why did you sign it over?" she asked. "Someone told me it would save on estate taxes when I died. I didn't hire an attorney to verify that. I just signed." Vivian was quiet for another moment. "You signed it over, but you're still living there." "I'm still living there." "Were there any conditions in the transfer document about right of residence?" I looked at her. No conditions at all. I signed a simple form." Vivian nodded. No surprise, no pity, just processing information. "In that case, we need to talk about two things. One is work. I have a commission I believe only you can do. The second is legal. I want you to meet a friend of mine who's an attorney." "Legal first," I said. Vivian Ashford looked at me, and for the first time that morning, she smiled genuinely. "I always knew you understood priorities." But before the legal discussion, Vivian Ashford placed a small box on the table in front of me. Inside was a handwritten order description, her handwriting, small and neat in the way of someone who learned to write before computers. The commission requires detail to convey its significance. Vivian Ashford was preparing to attend the Council of Fashion Designers of America's Lifetime Achievement Ceremony, one of the most prestigious awards in American fashion. The event was scheduled for May. And Vivian, co-founder of one of New York's most important fashion houses over 50 years, did not want to wear any other label to that ceremony. "I want to wear something made by the dressmaker I trust most," she said. "That person is you." I read the order description. A floor-length dark gown, not pure black, but the deep darkness of seawater at night, with hand-embroidered detail on the chest in a small rose motif. The primary fabric was a high-end synthetic silk of the kind she had used in Ashford Collection's first collection in 1978. A fabric no longer produced to its original formula, but Vivian said she knew a supplier in Lyon, France, who still had a small quantity in inventory. An outer jacket in lightweight matching wool, standing collar, no buttons, held only by gravity and the cut. "No sewing machines," I said when I finished reading. "No sewing machines," Vivian confirmed. "We'll address that. I know someone who doesn't need top equipment to do top work. You proved that when you had only the second-hand faff you bought used. But I also know that to do this properly, that you need space and tools. That's why I want you to meet David Park first." David Park, the attorney Vivian mentioned, specialized in real estate law and civil property disputes, with an office in Midtown, and had known Vivian for 20 years through his work on several design copyright disputes for Ashford Collection. Vivian called him right in front of me and booked an appointment for the following day. When I was about to leave, Vivian stood and shook my hand. "Martha," she said, "I need to say something. 4 years ago, I told you that when you needed me, you should call. You waited 4 years to call. I'm not saying that to reproach you. I'm saying it so that this time, don't wait that long again." I looked at the 73-year-old woman standing in front of me and couldn't speak for a moment. "Now, understood," I said finally. "Next time won't take as long. Tuesday, February 18th. I met David Park in his office in a building on 52nd Street. David Park was Korean-American, second generation, grew up in Flushing, Queens. In his early 50s, temples already gray, the manner of someone who has heard too many complicated stories and doesn't need to add his own emotions to anyone else's. I placed on his desk a copy of the apartment transfer document that I had found in my nightstand drawer the previous night. I hadn't been able to sleep and had used the time to retrieve all the paperwork I could find. David Park read for 15 minutes, said nothing, made pencil notes in the margins, turned it over twice, then looked up. "When did you sign this?" "April of last year." "Did any attorney advise you before signing?" "No." "Who gave you this to sign?" "Kevin Reeves, my son-in-law. He told me it was a simple procedure to avoid estate taxes. And you didn't read it carefully before signing? I sat still for a moment. I read it, but not carefully enough. I trusted Kevin at that point. David Park nodded, not judging, just confirming the information. This transfer document has no residency condition for you, meaning legally you no longer have automatic right of residence in that apartment. However, there are a few points that could be argued. Which ones? First, you transferred without receiving adequate information about the legal consequences, meaning you were not properly counseled. This is grounds to challenge the validity of the transfer under certain conditions. Second, you are still living in the apartment. That establishes a form of de facto residency that a court may recognize, particularly if it can be demonstrated that the transfer was the result of misrepresentation or inadequate disclosure. And my equipment? That's a related but separate matter. Kevin Reeves sold your personal property, not apartment property, without your consent. That constitutes theft or unlawful conversion of personal property, depending on interpretation. Damages can be sought. I looked at David Park. What are the odds? He didn't answer right away. Depends on evidence. Do you have receipts for the equipment? Yes. I have kept receipts for everything for 20 years. Mrs. Szczepanska taught me that. She said a professional craft person must have documentation for her tools. For the first time in our meeting, David Park's expression shifted slightly. Not a smile, but something close to respect. Those receipts matter a great deal. And do you have any witnesses to Kevin selling the equipment? I thought. My neighbor on the 12th floor, Mrs. Elena Castillo, told me she saw people moving items out of my apartment on February 7th. She asked the movers, and they said the family had hired them to clear out some storage. A sworn declaration from Mrs. Castillo would be useful. David Park made a note. And do you have any texts or emails from Kevin or Rebecca related to the sale or the clearing out? Nothing was communicated to me beforehand, but Kevin did send me a text afterward when I asked. I still have it on my phone. Keep everything, David Park said. Delete nothing. I need you to show me that message and anything else related. We worked for 2 more hours. When I left David Park's office that afternoon, I had a plan in my head. Not the plan of someone trying to get even or recover what felt emotionally theirs. The plan of someone addressing a practical problem with practical tools. That has always been when I work best. March, I worked on 2 things simultaneously. Vivian Ashford's commission and the legal case with David Park. Vivian had arranged for me to use a workspace in the Ashford Foundation building on 47th Street. A wide room on the 3rd floor with good light, a large work surface, and 2 new Bernina machines that Vivian described as organizational equipment that I was welcome to use as needed. There was also a young assistant named Maya Chen who could help with basic tasks like straight cutting and pattern layout, while I focused on the technically complex elements. The lion silk arrived on March 12th, 4 meters, exactly as I had specified, wrapped carefully in white tissue paper inside a rigid cardboard box. I opened the box in the 47th Street workroom and spread the fabric on the table, letting the morning light fall across it. Son looked. This was the kind of fabric that people tend to describe with words like luxurious or premium, words that convey nothing real. What I saw was, this fabric speaks to light in a way that very few fabrics do. The surface doesn't reflect uniformly, but shifts depending on the angle of view and the weave, though to the naked eye it appears only as deep solid darkness. When held under raking light, reveals threads of fine gold running lengthwise at a ratio of 1:20. This was a weaving technique the lion supplier had kept proprietary since the 1960s. Mrs. Szczepanska had shown me how to recognize it when I was 16. I picked up the scissors and began cutting the pattern. While I worked with the fabric, David Park worked with the documents. He found 3 significant things in the file. First, the apartment transfer document contained a technical defect. It lacked the consideration clause required under New York law when transferring real estate between family members in a gift transfer. This created legal grounds to challenge the validity of the transfer. Second, Kevin Reeves, in the text he had sent me after selling the equipment, had written, "We'll use that money to renovate the shared spaces in the apartment." That sentence acknowledged that he knew the money came from selling my property and was being applied to their own purposes. This was evidence of unlawful conversion. Third, Mrs. Elena Castillo, the 12th floor neighbor, agreed to provide a sworn declaration about what she had observed on February 7th. She added that she had seen Kevin Reeves speaking with the moving company outside the building and had heard him mention clearing out the stock, a small but important additional detail. "I think we have enough to proceed," David Park said at the mid-March meeting. "Not 100% certainty, that doesn't exist in law, but strong enough to make a serious claim." "Rebecca will have to face this," I said. David Park looked at me. "Do you want to proceed?" I took a few real seconds to think, not hesitating out of uncertainty, but to make sure my answer was coming from the right place. "I don't want to destroy my daughter's marriage or put Kevin in prison. I want my apartment rights restored and fair compensation for my work equipment. That's all." "That is a reasonable and well-grounded claim," David Park said. "I'll draft a demand letter to send them next week." David Park's letter reached Rebecca and Kevin on Friday, March 21st, a Friday, when Kevin was preparing to leave for a weekend in the Hamptons with friends. I don't know the details of the conversation between the two of them after they read it. I only know the result through what happened next. Kevin called me that afternoon. For the first time since he had sold my equipment, he called me directly. "What exactly are you doing?" His voice, the first time I had heard this in 3 years, was not entirely steady. He still had the distance of a man who wants to be in control, but there was something underneath it that I recognized as he was surprised. He had not expected me to do this. "I am requesting compensation for my work equipment that was sold without authorization and requesting a review of the apartment transfer through proper legal procedure," I said. Calm, clear, no anger. "You already signed the apartment over to Rebecca. The transfer was executed with a technical defect and without proper disclosure of legal consequences," I said. "My attorney has identified that. I would like to resolve everything through legal channels." A pause. "This doesn't need to go to court." "I agree. That's why my attorney sent a letter proposing negotiation first. Have you read the negotiation proposal?" Another pause, longer. "I'll speak with our attorney." "Goodbye, Kevin," I said, and ended the call. I put the phone down in the 47th Street workspace and looked at the silk fabric on the table. The dress bodice, already cut, waiting to be seamed together. Maya Chen was watching from her corner of the room with an expression that wasn't asking, but was paying attention. "Let's keep working," I said. 2 days after the call with Kevin, Rebecca called me. Not Kevin. Rebecca. She called in the evening when I was in the apartment bedroom. I was still sleeping there, following David Park's advice not to voluntarily vacate during the legal dispute. I took her call in the darkness, sitting on the edge of the bed. Rebecca didn't speak in the way that people tend to imagine when they picture a mother-daughter conversation in situations like this. No tears, no large apologies, no extended explanations. She spoke in the low, exhausted voice of someone who hasn't been sleeping enough. "Mom," she said, "do you really want to take this to court?" "I don't want to go to court," I said. My attorney offered a negotiation proposal. "That's the best way to resolve this without going to court." Kevin says the proposal isn't reasonable. The proposal asks for market rate compensation for my work equipment and for revision of the apartment transfer to add a lifetime residency clause for me. That is not a demand to take the apartment back entirely, only to ensure that I have the right to live there until I die, which was the original intention when I signed it over. There was a sigh on the line. Then Rebecca said the thing I hadn't expected to hear from her. Kevin was wrong to do this. I know that. I've known it from the beginning, but I didn't say anything. I sat in the dark and heard that sentence. Not satisfaction, not immediate relief. Just the truth arriving late. In the way truth tends to arrive when people no longer have any other choice but to stop pretending. I hear you, I said. Can you forgive me? I thought for a moment. Forgiveness is something that happens over time, not over the phone. Right now, what I need is to resolve the legal problem properly. After that, we can talk about other things. Kevin won't agree easily. That's Kevin's decision and yours. My attorney will continue through proper procedure if there's no negotiated settlement. After I hung up, I lay in the darkness and looked at the ceiling. Outside the window, New York was going late. The sounds of the city, distant horns, the light that never fully goes out. I thought about Rebecca, the daughter I had raised on 40 years of sewing. I thought about what she had just said. I've known it from the beginning, but I didn't say anything. That was the most painful thing of everything that had happened. Not Kevin selling my equipment. He was a stranger to me in many essential ways, a man I had never fully trusted. But Rebecca, knowing and staying silent. Rebecca, the girl I had sat beside every night before bed for 17 years before she went to college. The girl I had made a first party dress for when she was 3 years old, had stood in the kitchen doorway with a cup of coffee and not looked me in the eye. I didn't cry that night, but it was the first time I understood that there are wounds that cannot be sewn closed in the ordinary way, and I needed to accept that before I could move forward. Friday, March 28th. A mediation session at New York Civil Court. Kevin Reeves arrived with his attorney, a young man in a dark Armani suit who looked like he was auditioning for a courtroom drama. Rebecca came with Kevin, sat beside him but did not look at him. I arrived with David Park and Vivian Ashford. Vivian had offered to attend as a character witness, and I didn't decline. The mediating judge was a black woman in her early 60s, thick, dark-framed glasses, a manner of speaking that was direct in the way of someone who has been settling family disputes long enough that nothing surprises her anymore. David Park presented. Kevin's attorney responded. The mediating judge asked several questions, paying particular attention to the technical defect in the transferred document and Kevin's text message. When it was my turn to speak, I was brief and clear. I was not seeking to reclaim full ownership of the apartment. I wanted two things: a lifetime residency clause formalized in the property documents and compensation for the equipment sold without authorization at a reasonable market price. How much is that damage? The judge asked. The two Berninas at market value are approximately $14,000. The custom oak table around $2,000. Fabric and notions, according to receipts I still have, is approximately $12,000. Total is around $28,000. The judge looked at Kevin Reeves. Do you have records of the amount the equipment sold for? Kevin's attorney whispered to him. Kevin frowned. I'll need to see the documentation for that transaction, the judge said. At the end of the mediation session, the judge issued a recommendation. The lifetime residency clause to be added to the property documents within 30 days. The equipment damage compensation to be $25,000, paid within 60 days. Both parties had 2 weeks to decide whether to accept the recommendation or take the matter to formal court. Kevin and his attorney spoke privately in the hallway. I sat in the mediation room with David Park and Vivian. After 15 minutes, Kevin's attorney returned and said they accepted the recommendation. I nodded. Not a nod of satisfaction in the sense of victory. The nod of a person who has completed the necessary work and is ready for the next thing. And there was Luisa Ramirez in 2021, a 28-year-old Puerto Rican woman. placing a custom order for the first time in her life for her PhD commencement at Columbia. She arrived at the workroom looking like someone unsure of her right to be there, clutching her reference notes and apologizing more than necessary. I sat her down, made her a cup of tea, and asked what she was researching. Luisa Ramirez was writing about the history of garment workers in New York in the 20th century, about the immigrant seamstresses who built this city's garment industry. We talked for 2 hours before I took a single measurement. I made her a navy two-piece, clean cut, no extraneous detail. The dress of someone standing before an audience on the basis of intellect, not appearance. She sent me a photograph from the Defense Day. I put it in the green tin box. I tell these stories not to prove that I am an important dressmaker or have had an interesting life, but because when Kevin Reeves called my work machine racket, he was not only insulting me, he was insulting Angela Ferrara and Dorothy Chen and Luisa Ramirez and every person who had stood on the fitting platform in my workroom and found in the focused silence of a fitting something they needed. The sound of the machine is not noise. It is the sound of work being done properly. Maya Chen was someone I didn't expect to become a significant part of this story when she first appeared. She was a temporary assistant studying graphic design, waiting for an opportunity in her own field. But there are people you meet and recognize immediately as having genuine curiosity. Not polite curiosity, but curiosity because they truly want to understand. Maya Chen was one of those people. Over the weeks of working together, she asked questions I hadn't been asked in a long time. Not the questions of someone learning for information, but the questions of someone who wants to understand why. Why stump work embroidery follows the direction of a subject's natural growth. Why lion silk differs from Shanghai silk in the way it catches light. Why I chose hand stitching for the collar detail instead of the machine. Because the human hand can sense the tension of the fiber in a way a machine cannot, I explained for that last question. A machine makes things uniform. A human hand is not uniform in the precise mechanical sense, but it's uniform in the living sense, in the sense of being appropriate to what the fabric actually is at each point. Maya took notes. Then she set her pen down and asked, "Have you ever thought about writing these things down, like a technique book or a craft memoir?" I thought about the question. Mrs. Szczepanska never wrote anything down. Her knowledge passed through hands and eyes, not through words. I had never written either. "Haven't thought about it," I said. "You should," Maya said. "What you know, not many people know. And of those who do know, not everyone can explain it the way you can." I didn't promise her anything right then, but the question stayed. Mrs. Szczepanska had taught me everything she knew, not through a book, but by doing things together. But when she died, many things went with her, not because she kept secrets, but because there were things she didn't have enough time to pass on fully, or that I didn't have enough time to learn. Each generation loses something when there isn't enough time and attention. Perhaps it was time to begin writing down what I knew. Not because I think myself exceptional, but because it's what I owe Mrs. Szczepanska. Making sure what she passed on to me doesn't stop with me. April. I did not leave the Upper East Side apartment. The lifetime residency clause had been added to the property documents by the deadline. David Park confirmed that on March 25th. The $25,000 compensation would arrive by the end of May. But I need to be honest, although I had legal residency, that apartment was no longer a place I wanted to live. The workroom had become Rebecca's yoga studio, old wood floors covered by a purple exercise mat, the window looking toward Central Park blocked by a leaf pattern yoga curtain. The living room held the cognac leather sofa with nowhere comfortable for me to sit. Kevin said nothing more to me after the mediation. He moved past me in the apartment the way people move past something irrelevant. Rebecca spoke to me daily, but in the way of someone learning to speak again. Careful, deliberate, not yet at ease, but trying. I didn't push. I didn't pull. I was simply there and let time do its share of the work. Meanwhile, the gown was taking shape in the 47th Street workspace. The main work of April was the embroidery, the small rose detail on the chest, according to the motif Vivian and I had agreed on. Not a stylized modern rose, but a botanical rose. Each petal embroidered separately with visible veining, each small leaf in slightly different shades depending on the angle of light. This technique is called stump work, three-dimensional raised embroidery, a 17th century technique from England and Ireland, which Mrs. Szczepanska had taught me from the old embroidery technique book she had brought with her from Poland. Maya Chen sat across from me in the afternoons, helping with simpler elements while I handled the primary work. She wasn't learning embroidery. She was studying graphic design and working temporarily for the Ashford Foundation while she waited for another opportunity. But she had the patience and fine eye of someone who sees detail, and after 2 weeks sitting beside me, she began asking the right technical questions. "Why do you embroider upward instead of left to right?" she asked one afternoon. "Because roses grow upward," I said. "If you embroider in the direction a living thing naturally develops, the stitching carries a different quality. Difficult to explain theoretically, but someone who sees it will feel the difference, even if they don't know why." Maya noted that in the small notebook she always carried. I didn't comment, but I noticed. In early April, Vivian Ashford made a proposal. "There's a ground floor space in the Ashford Foundation building that's currently available," she said one afternoon while we were checking the gown's progress. It was a photographer's studio previously. One large room, one smaller room in the back, a bathroom, north-facing front windows. Good light for someone working with color. I think it would suit a sewing studio. I looked at her. "Vivienne, the rent is 1/3 of the local market rate," she continued in a practical voice. "And I'm offering a 3-year lease so you have stability without worrying about rent increases. This isn't charity, it's business. I want a good dressmaker in my building, and I want it to be you." I thought about it for a few days. The $25,000 in compensation plus my remaining savings were enough to buy new equipment and pay the first year's rent even with no clients. But at the rate Vivian was offering, I could start without burning through my capital in the first 6 months. And there was something else. The Upper East Side apartment, despite the legal right of residency, was no longer home in any real sense. I could live there, but I didn't want to. I needed new space, not to escape the past, but because new space allows you to build a future without continually stepping through the ruins of what was lost. I found a small studio apartment in Chelsea. Enough room for one person with a small work area in case I needed to work from home. The rent was higher than I wanted, but manageable. I moved in at the start of April, bringing only what truly mattered: clothes, books, the green tin box, the small blue notebooks that had been David Hoffman's, which I had always kept, and Mrs. Szczepanska's cutting scissors. The Henkel's 1731 that she had left to me when she died. The single thing that had survived everything, because I always kept them on my person. Never left them at the workroom. I closed the door of the Chelsea apartment on the first evening and stood in the small space with only the things that mattered most, and felt something I had not felt in many years. Genuinely light. Not light because everything was fine, but light because I no longer had to pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. Vivian Ashford came for the final fitting on Tuesday, May 6th. This fitting was different from the previous ones. Not adjustments, but confirmation. I stood behind her as she looked into the full-length mirror in the fitting area of the 47th Street workspace. Maya Chen stood in her corner of the room, saying nothing. The gown was the deep darkness of seawater at night. Under white light, it appeared nearly black, but when Vivian turned slightly, the gold threads hidden in the lion silk caught the light, and the entire gown took on a depth that no single flat color can produce. The stumpwork rose embroidery on the right chest was raised just enough that someone standing close could see every individual detail clearly, but from a distance it read only as texture in the fabric. Vivian Ashford stood in front of the mirror and said nothing for about a minute. I didn't hurry her. Maya Chen didn't hurry her. There are moments that need to be left in silence. "Martha?" Vivian said finally, not turning from the mirror. "This is the finest work I have ever worn." Not ordinary praise. Not "how beautiful" or "how wonderful." This was the judgment of a 73-year-old woman who had lived in the fashion world for 50 years and knew exactly the weight of every word she spoke. "Thank you," I said. Martha's studio opened officially on Friday, May 9th at 47 West 55th Street, ground floor, New York, NY10019. Not a grand launch event or press invitations, only a small sign outside the door. Black letters on white, Martha's Studio/Custom Tailoring and Design, and the north-facing front windows that let the afternoon light in at exactly the angle I needed for working with color. And the new Bernina machines I had bought with part of the compensation money, standing in exactly the right places, the way equipment that is right always knows its place. The first client arrived on the morning of the opening day, not one of my old clients. She was a 40-year-old woman named Claire Nguyen, an editorial assistant at a fashion magazine, who had heard from Maya Chen, who had become my official assistant after I offered the position and she accepted immediately, that a new dressmaker had opened a studio on 55th Street. Claire Nguyen needed a suit made for her younger sister's graduate school thesis defense. Not a large or complex commission, but it was Martha's studio's first commission, and I brought to it the full attention I had brought to every commission since I first started taking work on Ludlow Street at 23. The first week of May brought 3 orders, the second week, 6. By the end of May, I had appointments booked through July, not because I advertised. Vivian Ashford mentioned the studio in a New York Times interview about the CFDA ceremony, referencing the gown and the person who made it in a way that prompted a number of people to seek me out. And when people came, they told others. That is always how this craft has worked, never through advertising, always through word of mouth from someone who has worn the work and knows. The CFDA Lifetime Achievement Ceremony took place on the evening of Thursday, May 22nd, at Lincoln Center. Vivian Ashford walked to the podium in the gown dark as nighttime seawater and the weightless, buttonless wool jacket, platinum hair short and neat, and stood at the microphone without consulting any notes. I sat in the 8th row, beside Eleanor Ashford and Maya Chen. Not the front row. Vivian didn't offer, and I didn't ask. The 8th row was enough to see the rose embroidery on the right chest clearly when the stage lights caught it, and to see the gold threads in the lion silk catch the light in the way I had known they would from the morning I first spread the fabric on the work table. Vivian Ashford spoke about 50 years in the fashion industry, about the teachers and collaborators who had shaped her, about what she believed was genuine value in a field that people often judge by what is fast and immediately visible. At the end of her remarks, she said, "I am wearing this gown tonight, not to represent a brand or a famous designer's name. I'm wearing it because it was made by the finest dressmaker I have known in 50 years of this industry, a woman who has worked in this field not through connections or capital or marketing, but through her hands and 40 years of patience. Her name is Martha Kowalski, and her studio is at 47 West 55th Street if you need good work done." The hall applauded. I sat in the 8th row and did not applaud along with them because my hands were occupied, gripping the cream-colored printed program. Maya Chen leaned over and whispered, "Are you all right?" "I'm all right," I said. And this time, I meant it completely. In the Chelsea studio apartment, the green tin box stands on the bookshelf by the window that looks out at the High Line. Every morning before leaving for the studio, I stop for a second and look at it. Not open it, just look, in the way people look at familiar things to confirm they are still there. The tin box now holds a few more things than it did before February. The paper with Vivian Ashford's address and phone number, I kept it, even though I no longer need it because I know the number by heart. The printed program from the CFDA ceremony that I held so tightly in Lincoln Center that evening in May. And a smaller piece of paper. The handwritten receipt for the Henkel scissors from the old notions shop on Canal Street, the yellowed invoice in faded ink, dated 1979. I had bought those scissors from the second-hand store with 3 months of saved earnings. It was the first time I purchased a real professional tool that was entirely my own, not borrowed or shared. The shopkeeper, an old Polish man named Mr. Wisniewski, knew Mrs. Szczepanska, and when he heard her name, he took the scissors out of the glass case and said, "These are a professional seamstress's scissors. Mrs. Szczepanska will know why." I didn't understand right then. Only when I brought them home and Mrs. Szczepanska held them up to check them, she nodded and said, "Mr. Wisniewski knew what you needed. These are the right scissors." The Henkel's 1731 had followed me through 40 years. From the Lower East Side to the Upper East Side, from rented workrooms to the 14th floor apartment, and now to the studio on West 55th Street. They were the one thing Kevin Reeves couldn't take, because I always kept them on me, the way Mrs. Szczepanska had instructed. Good scissors should not leave the seamstress's hands. When I pick up those scissors and cut fabric in the new studio, I think about Mr. Wisniewski and Mrs. Szczepanska and all the people who had stood in the chain of this craft, each passing on to the next, not only skill, but an attitude toward skill, that it accumulates over years and cannot be rushed, that it belongs to the learner, not the teacher, and that when you do your work well, you are not only working for yourself, but continuing something that began before you and will continue after you. That is the thing no one can sell or sign over or take away. Rebecca called me in early June and asked if we could meet. Not at the apartment, she suggested meeting at a coffee shop on West 72nd Street, a place we used to go to together when she was in college. I arrived on time. Rebecca was already there, sitting at the corner table with 2 cups of coffee she had ordered ahead of time. She remembered, "I take mine black, no sugar." That small detail made me stop for a second at the door before going in. We sat across from each other. No Kevin. No planned agenda. "Mom," Rebecca said, "I don't know where to begin." "Start where you actually want to," I said. She looked at her cup. "I knew Kevin was selling your things before you came home. He told me you wouldn't need them anymore, that resting was what was best for you at this age. I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because if I didn't believe him, I'd have to face other things I was avoiding." I listened without interrupting. "I know you can't forgive me immediately," she continued. "I'm not asking for that. I just want you to know that I'm trying to understand what happened. Not only what happened to you, but what happened in myself." I looked at my daughter, 33 years old, her face still showing the marks of recent sleepless weeks, but her eyes clearer than I had seen them lately. And I thought about the question I hadn't asked myself enough. Where had I gone wrong? "I was wrong too," I said. "Not in signing the apartment over. I needed to read it more carefully before I signed. But before that, over many years. I wasn't direct enough with you about Kevin, about the things I was worried about. I was silent because I didn't want to interfere in your happiness. And that silence was part of the problem." Rebecca looked at me. "You were worried about Kevin from early on?" "From the wedding," I said, plainly. The time for plain speaking had come. She was quiet for a moment. "I knew that too. Somewhere." We sat in that coffee shop for 2 hours. Not resolving everything. You can't resolve everything in one afternoon. But it was the first time since February we had genuinely talked to each other in the full sense of those words. When we said goodbye, Rebecca asked if she could visit the studio sometime. I said yes. Not now, but yes. In July, I started a new habit. Early mornings before going to the studio, I walk to Hudson River Park, stand at the water's edge looking toward New Jersey while the sun is rising from the east behind me, and the light turns the surface of the river gold and orange. New York from the waterfront in early morning is a different city from New York at midday. Less noise, more air, the light not yet bounced back from hundreds of glass towers. I have lived in this city for 68 years, and I still find perspectives I've never had before, if I'm willing to look at the right time from the right place. In those mornings, I tend to think, not worry, not plan, but think in the way people call letting the mind rest, which is actually letting the mind work without being forced. I think about what Kevin Reeves said. You should rest and stop disturbing us with all that machine racket. I have thought about that sentence many times in the months since, and each time I find another layer of meaning in it. Not just Kevin Reeves's cruelty toward me personally, but a worldview about handcraft, about age, about the value of skill in a world where everything is increasingly measured by scale and speed and view counts. Machine racket. 40 years of skill accumulated stitch by stitch, cut by cut, afternoon by afternoon, learning the trade from Mrs. Szczepanska. All of it reduced to machine racket by a 38-year-old fund manager in an office with soundproofed walls. But here is what I have learned. Genuine skill does not need to be protected from others' disrespect. It protects itself because it is real, not something that depends on anyone's acceptance or rejection. The 2 Berninas were sold, but my hands remained. The workroom was painted over in gray, but the knowledge of stump work stitching was still in my fingers. Kevin Reeves could sell my equipment, but he could not sell the 40 years I had learned from Mrs. Szczepanska. Only skill follows you to the end. People's goodwill does not. I am not someone who tends to compose lists of lessons. The sewing trade didn't teach me to think in lists. It taught me to think in process and structure and the relationships between parts. But there are some things that, after everything that happened this past year, I want to say in the clearest terms I can. First, skill is what protects itself. The 2 Berninas were sold. The workroom was repainted. But what I know about stump work and how lion silk catches light and how to cut to flatter a woman's body at 50, those things remained in my hands. Equipment can be replaced. Skill cannot be replaced from the outside. It can only be built from the inside, through the time and patience of the person learning. Second, people need to know what is in the documents they sign. I signed the apartment transfer without reading carefully enough, because I trusted Rebecca and Kevin at that point. That trust was not wrong emotionally, but it was wrong practically. Trusting family does not mean you skip reading what they ask you to sign. Those are 2 separate things, and I had confused them. Third, the professional community is something important that people tend to undervalue until they need it. Vivian Ashford called me the finest dressmaker she had known in 50 years. That mattered not because it was praise from a famous person, but because it was a recognition from someone inside the same trade, someone with enough knowledge to evaluate it. Professional relationships built on mutual respect and quality of work last longer and hold more firmly than many other kinds. Fourth, forgiveness and trust are 2 different things and recover at different rates. I can forgive Rebecca for what happened. That process is ongoing, slow but ongoing. But trust, the particular trust between a mother and daughter that I had before February, that is something that needs to be rebuilt from the beginning in a way no one can shortcut. I don't force myself to forgive on a schedule or to trust on expectation. I let each thing move at its natural pace. And fifth, the most important thing to me, 68 is not the age to stop if you don't want to stop. It is only a number. My hands still work well. My eyes still see fine thread and subtle color. My mind still plans cuts and estimates structure and remembers techniques learned at 14. The person who told me that at 68 I should rest and stop disturbing people with machine racket, that person was projecting onto me what they believed about old age, not what is actually true about me. I refuse to be a mirror for what other people want old age to look like. I write these words on an evening in September, sitting in the small studio on West 55th Street after everyone has gone home and the light outside the window has shifted to the yellow street light of New York at night. On the work table in front of me is a piece of deep navy wool waiting to be cut. A commission from a woman about to defend her doctoral dissertation who wants something properly fitted for the occasion. I will do that order well, the way I have done every order well since I was 23 years old on Ludlow Street. Not to prove anything, but because that is how I work and how I live, and 68 is not the time to change the things that have been right from the beginning. Martha's studio has 17 regular clients as of the end of August, with appointments booked through October. Maya Chen is learning stumpwork embroidery. She's not yet skilled, but she asks the right questions, and that is the most important thing. I have offered to teach her the way Mrs. Szczepanska taught me, not from a curriculum, but by working side by side and noting errors when necessary. She accepted without hesitation. Rebecca calls every week. We don't always have much to say. Sometimes it's only 15 minutes of ordinary conversation. But the phone rings, and I answer, and she calls, and I pick up, and that is a thin thread being rewoven into something new, slowly and carefully. Kevin Reeves and I do not speak. I don't expect that to change soon, and I have learned how not to need that to change in order to continue living well. Vivian Ashford called from Paris. She is there at the invitation of a young designer seeking her counsel, and said the gown received many inquiries after the CFDA ceremony, that 2 fashion editors want to write about the studio. You should prepare for attention, she said. I'll do my work well, I said. The rest will take care of itself. Vivian Ashford laughed at the other end of the line, her short, real laugh, unchanged from the first time I heard it in 2009. I have always liked the way you look at a problem, Martha. Mrs. Szczepanska died in 2010 at the age of 92 in the Greenpoint apartment she had rented since 1951 and never left. I visited her 2 weeks before she died. She still recognized me, still asked what I was sewing, still reminded me that good fabric is wasted on poor stitching. I brought the Henkel scissors she had left me and placed them in her hands for a moment. She held them, her fingers tracing the steel blade in the familiar way, then gave them back to me. Keep doing good work, she said, Polish mixed with English the way she did when tired. That is all that needs to be done. That is all that needs to be done. Keep doing good work. 68 years old, sitting in the small studio on West 55th Street, a piece of deep navy wool on the table waiting to be cut, the Henkel scissors in my hand. New York, outside the window, moving into evening the way it always does. Loud and bright, and never fully quiet. I pick up the scissors and begin to cut. No one needs to be watching. No one needs to applaud. Only do it right. Because that is what Mrs. Szczepanska taught me. Because that is how I have lived for 40 years. And because in everything I have learned and lost and rebuilt. This is the one thing that does not change and does not need to change. Only skill follows you to the end. Human goodwill does not.